Sorry, there was a lag in the recording, so I wasn't sure if I was recording or not. So we're gonna give this a shot. Okay, so I'm gonna call this domain and range life hacks. So these are some things that I think are really important. You guys actually worked with them last week, but I wanted to see if you could pick up on them. So the big thing you guys worked with in one of your activities was inequalities. Okay, so just as a reminder, let me get a marker. X means domain. So all of these values along the x-axis, those are what we look at. We look at the x coordinate in that point. That is our domain. Okay, those are what we look for. Okay, that means that our y values are the range. Okay, and we always look bottom to top, so along that y-axis, which means we always look at our y coordinates if we're trying to figure out our range. Okay, I also know, let me see if I can move this around a little bit, sorry, I'm trying to work with a new document camera. So on this particular graph right here, I want to see if we can figure out the difference between this first inequality and the second inequality, and then we'll do it again with range. So I'm going to draw two graphs here. First graph I'm going to do in blue. Okay, so we're going to make it just kind of small like that. And then the second one I'm going to make in red. Okay, so I'm pretty sure just based off the pictures you guys can tell the difference, but now it's which one goes where. Okay, so blue, I know that this is 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is -4, -1. This is 1, 2, 3. Oh, that's funny. And 4. Okay, so this blue graph only exists from -4 to -1. Okay, it only exists in those two x values, within those two x values. So we have a -4 and a -1. Okay, so notice how I drew those vertical lines down to see where they're at on the x-axis. So this red graph only exists between 1 and 4. Okay, so if I were to pause this graph and ask you, what is the difference between this and these two graphs, I think you'd be able to figure it out. Okay, honestly, I think you'd be able to figure it out. But let's look at range to see, excuse me, coffee, to see if you guys can figure it out, like for real, for real. Okay, so let's look at this graph down here. So I'm going to go ahead and draw again in blue and red. Okay, so now we're going to look at the range. So I'll actually just go ahead and draw these exact same graphs so we can see what they look like. So that's -1, 2, 3, 4, -4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so let's go ahead and just draw those. So there's the blue one and our red one. Okay, so this is all good and dandy. I think that's the one I want. Okay, sorry, trying to focus. These are the x values. When we're talking about range, we don't care about the x values, we only care about our y values. So instead of drawing a vertical line down, I'm going to take this blue marker and I'm actually going to draw a horizontal line because now I'm curious about where they cross the y-axis. So if I count up, 1, 2, this is 3, this is 4, that means this blue graph, the range only exists between 3 and 4. Okay? Outside of these blue lines, so if I were to do this right here, outside of these blue lines, the graph actually doesn't exist. Okay? So if I look at the red graph, we're going to do the same thing. Try and make it fit. So that's 1. And this one up here we already know is 4. Okay? So for some reason I like the numbers 1 and 4 today, I guess. So our blue graph exists between 3 and 4, and our red graph only exists between 1 and 4. Outside of those horizontal lines, they actually do not exist. So in terms of domain and range, the domain of the blue graph is from -4 to 1, and the range of the blue graph is from 3 to 4. Notice, too, how if I'm talking about domain, x is in the middle, and if I'm talking about range, y is in the middle. On your tests, quizzes, and EOC, I guarantee you this is how I'm going to try and trick you by switching up the letters. Okay, I'm also going to try and trick you by switching up your inequality symbols. So if you caught on that the inequalities change based off of the circle, you're one step ahead. Okay, so give me a second to get prepared and see if you can figure this next part out. Okay, so if you figured it out, we're gonna woo with highlighter. If you're faced with a less than or greater than symbol, your circle is going to be open. Okay, which means if you have the less than or equal to or the greater than or equal to symbol, I have these little lines down here, you actually have a closed circle. Okay, and I have one more example for you. Okay, so let me move the camera a little bit. It won't move. Let me figure this out in 1 second. All right, so here we go. This is actually very similar to a typical graph problem you might see on the EOC or on a test or on a pop quiz or something that I might give you. You have a graph that looks like this. I want to know the domain and the range. Okay, notice I left blanks for the symbols, okay, but I want to know domain and range, and there's something in this graph that looks a little different. There's a little arrow here. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through this. Okay, and these are the steps that I personally would take. I totally understand if you're like, Stark, that doesn't work for me. But if I were given this problem, this is how I would solve it. Okay, the very first thing I would do is label my coordinates. So I know that this will stay domain as X in blue, so I'm going to keep that color similar, and my range is Y. Okay, so I went ahead and labeled them. Now I'm going to actually number the coordinates, so that way I get my numbers correct. So this is -1, -2, that means right here is -3. This is 1, 2, 3, -1, -2, -3, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so I think the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this. Okay, if I want to look at domain first, domain is left to right. Okay, so the domain is going to start at -3. This dot actually doesn't go any farther to the left. Okay, that's where it starts. So I know that domain is going to be -3, and because it's a closed circle, we're going to stick with a less than or equal to. Okay? Or greater than or equal to. I haven't had my coffee yet this morning. Give me a second. I'll come back and correct this video. Okay? And the range starts somewhere. Okay? So we're going to find the lowest point of the graph possible. Okay? That's right down here. Okay? And even though there's not a circle, that graph goes through that point, which means it has to be one of those symbols. But what is that point that the graph goes through? It goes through -3. Well, apparently I switched up my number. I like -3 today. Now, this is where the exception to the rule, I guess you could call it, comes in. We have an arrow. Okay? This arrow means infinity. And the symbol for an infinity is a sideways 8, like a sideways 8. So if you want to draw, like, turn your paper and draw an 8, you're welcome to. Or I just draw 2 circles next to each other. Okay. Infinity means that your graph keeps going and going and going and going. It will never stop. So if I were to zoom out on this graph and look at it from the moon, that means that the graph would start here. It wouldn't go any farther to the left, but that arrow means that it's going to keep going and going and going, and I would see that from the moon. Okay? So, infinity, and I'm going to do the symbol because I'm too lazy to write it out. Because it's a number that keeps going and going and going and going and going, think like Energizer Bunny. Because it keeps going, it doesn't stop, okay? That means it can never be equal to something, okay? It can never be equal, which means when we have an infinity sign, we have to use less than or greater than, okay? So our x value is going to be less than infinity because if I drew that, well, the arrow is going to go right through it, right? And our y value for our range, this is going to keep going up, so that's also infinity. Okay? Let me know if you have any questions.